Hello, I am Samares. I'm one of the Residence Life coordinators, and I would like to welcome you to this session called Decision Making, Critical Thinking 101.
Hey, I just met you, and this is crazy, but here's my number.
It has several sides. The first, I think for me personally, the most important side is it's the reputation at the residence.
Because you're responsible for the lives of others.
I was going to say, because it affects everyone.
Because if whatever decision you make is going to affect everybody.
Everyone else, yeah.
And, I mean, at the end of the day, you're there for your residents. So if you make a wrong decision, it's going to affect all of them. And these are people who've chosen to live in a residence because they're either not comfortable being by themselves or they're new to the city and therefore don't know anything. And if you make a wrong decision, that could affect their...
If there is some serious situation, some challenging situation, and you make a very wrong decision, you get a very bad image, which is very often difficult to change.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that. Exactly that.
Sorry.
But at the same time, sometimes, if unfortunately you do have to make a wrong decision, it's not the end of the world. Just learn from it and think about how you could do things differently. Don't beat yourself up.
One of the things is if things get really seriously bad, the first thing to do is get help, and sometimes people forget that, and then it turns bad. So that's
Maybe it's hard to look right at your baby, but
Just to focus your attention, the learning outcomes of this presentation will be to understand and articulate the value of good decision-making skills, to define the 3 key principles of critical thinking, and to apply the 8 practices of reflective thought to your own decision-making. Years of cognitive research have shown that the human mind works to create patterns through a process of induction. We'll collect details from here and there, and we'll just put them together to draw our conclusions. As an example, imagine yourself survivors in a shipwreck. You just washed ashore to an unknown land, and you have no idea where you are and what you're supposed to do. All of a sudden, this strange man approaches you and starts speaking to you in Spanish. Wouldn't that immediately let you believe that you're in Spain or in some other country that they speak Spanish? Well, there you go. You just inferred that pretty much everybody in this land speaks Spanish. But what if you don't have all the facts? What if 5 minutes later you meet someone that speaks to you in English, or in, say, Chinese? Our mind works more comfortably when we are aware of what to expect, when we have fit all of our beliefs in a general pattern that will guide our judgment and decision process every single time. However, sometimes that pattern needs to change. Sometimes we don't have all the facts, and that is something that we should keep in mind. There are 2 ways to change our pattern. There's the hard way. Discover that you have missed something major on the way, something that would force you to revise your principles or ideas in a way that would be embarrassing, place you in an awkward situation, maybe not even allow you to act, but force you to react to a situation. And then there is the easier way. Notice I didn't say easy. Allow for the fact that you don't have all the facts, and approach every situation as an opportunity to revise your core principles. Put them to the test with an open mind and a willing to change them if necessary. That's what we call critical thinking. If you followed my example, you probably reached the conclusion that thinking, when left unchecked, can sometimes be flawed. It could be biased, prejudiced, uninformed, distorted, partial, and can lead to bad decisions. Therefore, the value to critical thinking is that it is our correcting mechanism to our inclination to be ego and sociocentric. The 3 key principles to decision making: willingness to criticize oneself, reflective thought, and competence. As you will probably come to realize, a recurring theme during RA training will be personal development and practice. While we will be going over all of those three principles, the majority of the presentation will be focused on the second one, reflective thought. The other two will require practice in your own personal investment, and while we can cover them, we cannot make you proficient at them. The first step to applying successful critical thinking is to have willingness to criticize yourself. As surprising as it may sound to some, when it comes to making decisions, you will not always be right. Let me repeat that. You will not always be right. We all have our biases, prejudices, preconceived notions, and then we might be emotionally invested for or against a particular outcome. We might be prejudiced against a factor in the situation. Or, we might just be plainly arrogant. Therefore, we must be able to evaluate our own decision-making processes in order to discover potential biases. So when we make that decision, are we sure we have all the relevant information? Did we ignore some? Did we give credence to unverified information? Rumor mills? Did we make any unfounded inferences or interpretations of the information presented? The only way to avoid those pitfalls is through reflective thought. Before making the decision, stop and think. Deliberate. Consider the evidence that you have and investigate further for the evidence that you might not have. Consider the context in which you have to make a judgment. Consider the relevant criteria for making the judgment well. And also consider applicable methods or techniques for forming that judgment. We are lucky that along with our flawed thinking, sometimes, we have also been granted with certain competence to be able to counterbalance that. For example, use of logic, whether that is formal or informal. Use of intellectual standards. Completeness of evidence gathering. And our ability to be fully self-aware. What is this process of critical thinking that I keep referring to, though? There are certain steps to it. We need to identify our point of view, the purpose of making that decision. What are the questions that need to be asked? What is the evidence that we have or that we need to gather? What are certain inferences that we might have made along the way or that we need to make in order to reach the conclusion? Those are called assumptions. What are the implications and consequences that our decision will have? And finally, be able to evaluate all of those. Depending on the type of decision or problem, this process could take hours, days even. You can write it down, edit it, have it reviewed by others, or it may only take you a minute. This is not a mandatory checklist you have to submit to your supervisor every time you take a breath. This is for your own personal use, and with a little bit of common sense, you can make good use of it. The very first thing that we learn when we start dealing with people is that there are different points of view. Differences in perspectives. My perspective versus yours versus your residence. Therefore, we need to be able to identify those perspectives. What is the context? And what is your perspective? What are some of the shortcomings of your point of view? What other points of view are there? Are they valid? What insights do they offer? And you need to be able to identify strengths, weaknesses, and assumptions of your point of view and those of others. In a situation when you're dealing with residents, is this a resident you know well? Is this a resident that you like? Is it late at night or maybe too early in the morning? Were you interrupted from your work on a paper, perhaps? Or how would you feel if you were the resident? How would you want the RA to help or assist you? One thing that you should always keep in mind while having any type of conversation is, what is your purpose? What are you there for? What is your objective, the end aim of the situation? What exactly are you trying to accomplish? Identifying the purpose in any conversation is a two-way street. You need to know what your purpose is going in, and you also need to know what the purpose of the other party is. You need to be able to clearly define the question or issue at hand. Remember that it is difficult to think critically with vague or poorly defined issues. Is there a definitive answer to the question? Is it opinion-based? Are there any underlying issues or problems that are related to the current question? What exactly is the concern here? Half of the time, your residents don't really know. Traditionally, people gain status by spreading rumors. At the same time, traditionally people lose status by following those rumors. Make sure you get the facts. Use empirical data, evidence, facts, and other information you gain from watching and observing, like a good scientist would do. Ensure information is clear, accurate, and relevant to the question that you're asking. Don't be afraid to ask who, what, where, when, why, and how. Take notes of all of that. Be cognizant of your surroundings and other people in the area, and use all of your 5 senses. Do not guess. One of the core differences between good science and rumor mill is that where one uses deduction, the other uses inference. The process of deduction demands that all of your premises are true. Your conclusion will then be based on those premises. It is rather a process of moving from the general to the more specific. On the contrary, inference is the other way around. From a handful of premises that you assume or know to be true, you try to draw a conclusion that is much more general. Unfortunately, most times during decision making, we will happen to be somewhere in the middle between those two. You need to be mindful of the interpretations and the inferences in the process. What conclusions does the data lead me to? Is it specific or more general? What inferences am I making? Does the data support those inferences? Are there any possible other valid conclusions? One thing that really makes a difference between good deductive logic and poor inferential logic is assumptions. Don't assume. Remember, assume only makes an ass of you and me. We all know how it ends, and we all know what an assumption is. But can you really identify your assumptions? Can you back them with evidence? Does the data support them? And how are those assumptions affecting your point of view every time? If you really like the resident, are you more likely to believe them even if what they say is implausible or unlikely? What about a resident you dislike? And so you have defined the question. You know what your purpose is. You have gathered your data you kept your notes, and you try to stay away from assumptions. It's time to take action. What are your options? Remember that your first instinct may not be the best option. Sometimes in critical situations you don't have a lot of time to sit and ponder, but for those critical situations, we will make sure that you receive enough training. The rest is really up to you. When evaluating options, try to formulate pros and cons of each one. What options aren't available? And why not? If a non-available option is clearly the best, can you affect the situation to make one of those options available? Where is the fine line between thinking outside the box and taking into consideration all of the data that you have? As with every decision, there are implications and consequences that come out of it. Implications are claims that follow logically from other claims or truths. What implications will your decision have? What are the consequences of the action that you decide to take? And remember about different perspectives? What are the potential perceptions of others to my actions? If I do X, what will happen? Is it positive or negative? Do the perceived benefits outweigh the detriments? Collecting your data does not stop there, however. There comes the very important step of evaluating the decision that you just made. Did it work? What was the effectiveness of the decision? Could it have been more or less effective? What criteria are you using to determine that? And what would you change or keep the same if presented with a similar situation? Remember, every situation is a chance to learn. I'm sure that after 15 minutes into this presentation, you're all probably wondering, what does this have to do with my RA post? Well, as much as I would like to say that we will train you in all the situations that you will face as RAs, it would be pretty impossible to do that. Therefore, critical thinking is good in situations when there is a lot of gray area and some things are not clearly defined. Some helpful criteria to keep in mind: use what you do know to deduce what you don't. If your training doesn't clearly state something, it provides some sort of framework to assist with extrapolation. You're all very able individuals, students of the University of Edinburgh, and we trust you that you can do that. Student and staff health and safety is paramount for us. What is the potential liability for an action? And remember, if you don't know, ask. You're never alone. Learn to utilize returning staff and your line managers.